Hello. Welcome to this video about reading survey-based research from the MSc in Medical Education at the Swansea University Medical School. As always, we're going to be taking a pragmatic approach in this video. This video is not about helping you write your own surveys, although lots of the things we talk about will be useful for that. It's more about helping you get the most out of the existing education research literature, and there's a huge amount of it. The key thing we're going to be looking for then is to give you some tips and tricks that you can look for when reading these papers to work out, is this survey useful? As I said, there's a huge volume of existing education research that's been conducted using surveys, and a significant body of that has been conducted using questionnaires. And so it's questionnaires that we're mostly going to focus on in this video. The first thing to look for then when reading one of these questionnaire-based papers is whether or not the research question has been clearly articulated and defined. Is it a clear and specific question? Is there a hypothesis that's being tested? If there isn't a hypothesis, are there at very least some clear and specific objectives that the study is trying to get to? The next thing to look for then is who is doing the asking. Who is asking the questions in this questionnaire? It's very important for survey-based research for there to be some form of independence, some form of barrier between the person who's doing the asking and the person who's answering the questions. To give you a simple example of where this might go wrong, let's say somebody's conducting a questionnaire-based research study to look at whether or not newly qualified health professionals feel prepared for their world of work. If the person who's handing out the questionnaires is also the person who is responsible for organising the curriculum that prepared those people for the world of work, then you can see how that's going to profoundly influence the way that people respond to the questions. With all the things we're going to talk about in this video, there are going to be differences in between how important they are depending upon the context. And all of these things are also going to interact, and we'll try and outline some examples where we come across them. Related to this one then, who's doing the asking, it's important that the people who are doing the responding have some degree of anonymity, some degree of independence themselves. Again, this will depend upon what they're being asked about, but if they're being asked about things that they possibly shouldn't admit, then it's going to be more important that they are somehow anonymous. The next thing then, and possibly the most important, is who is actually answering the questions, who is filling in the questionnaire. The first thing to define, or the first thing to look for when reading a survey-based research paper, is do they define what the population is? What is the total number of people that they might have distributed the questionnaire to? Or what is the population that they're trying to represent in their survey-based research? One form of survey methodology is a census where everybody gets asked the questions, but most questionnaire and survey-based research papers don't do a census type approach. They take a sample of the population. The key thing then here, and something that very many survey-based research papers don't pay a huge amount of attention to, is whether or not the sample is representative of the population as a whole. Let's say the population consisted of, 2,000 medical students. Even though they are all medical students and they have that thing in common, they are also very different, and the ways in which they are different are themselves multiple and numerous. The key to getting a representative sample then is to make sure that the sample, let's say you take 200 of those medical students, represents the population of 2,000. Now, what does it mean to say that a sample is representative? Well, a lot of that depends on the study itself, but there are often some common factors. For example, you might want the sample to be representative in terms of gender, age, educational achievement, and so on. There are also going to be characteristics that are specific to the study. The key thing then is that your sample has the same percentage of those characteristics in as the population as a whole. How do researchers try to make that happen, and what are the sorts of things you might want to look for when reading a research paper? The key thing to look for is the sampling method, the sampling strategy. How have the researchers approached a particular group of people to try and persuade them to fill in the questionnaire? There are lots of different ways that this can be done. We don't have time to go through all of them. A simple rule of thumb is, if there is some account in the methodology of an attempt to make a sample representative, then that's a good thing. The key contrast is with the methodology of convenient sampling, which I will talk about in a bit of detail. This method is possibly the least likely to end up with a representative sample, and that it is very, very common. It involves handing out the questionnaire to whoever will take it, and then analysing the data from anyone who voluntarily fills it in. Now, you can get a representative sample this way, and there are some post hoc things you can do with the analysis to ensure that the sample is more or less representative. But we do know some things about the sorts of people who voluntarily fill in surveys, and they tend to have certain characteristics. They tend to be older, they tend to have a higher income, they tend to have a higher educational achievement in their background, they tend to be female. This is not necessarily a problem, but it does mean you're going to enrich people with those sorts of characteristics in a sample, and so it's less likely to be representative. There are some other things to look for in the sample and in the size of the sample and the types of characteristics of it. One of them is the response rate. If you've got a population of 10,000 and 9,000 of them filled in the questionnaire, that's a 90% response rate. That's really good. If only 1,000 of them filled it in, it's a 10% response rate. Therefore, when you've got a low response rate, it's far less likely that the sample is representative. The lower the response rate, the worse it is. There's a related characteristic, and that's completion rate. This is basically the percentage of people who completed the survey having started to fill it in. If you have a low completion rate, or there's a difference between the response rate and the completion rate, that suggests that the survey itself was too long, or was troubling, or was difficult, or there were technical problems, or there was some other issue that needs to be factored in when trying to determine whether or not the study is useful. The final thing to look for in terms of the size and representativeness of the sample is the overall size of it. And this is often misunderstood. Let's say you have 10,000 people who filled in your questionnaire. That's a very good thing. There's lots you can do with data that's generated from 10,000 people. But if the study is reporting a sample of 10,000 from a population of 10 million, then the response rate is very low, and it's far less likely that the sample is representative. If the sample of 10,000 comes from a population of 11,000, then that's much better. If you've got a population of 5,000 if you've got a sample of 5,000 from a population of 10,000, even though the sample is now half the size, it represents 50% of the population. Therefore, it's much more likely to be representative. The key thing then is that sample size isn't everything. Response rate is just as important, if not more important. And you want to make sure, first of all, that the study reports the response rate and that it's high when you're trying to determine how useful the study is. The next thing to look at then is the detail of the methodology. Is the methods reproducible? Basically, could you do the study again yourself on the basis of the information that's provided in the study? Key things to look for are: does the study report when the survey was taken? Where was it taken? Could you repeat it? Is the key question to ask. It's also important to know what the participants were asked to do. What instructions were the participants given when asked to fill in the questionnaire? How were they invited to fill in the questionnaire? The wording of this can be very important. If your survey is trying to ask people about, for example, a behaviour that's undesirable or that they shouldn't be reporting, is it clear what they're being asked to do? If students have been asked to fill in a survey about, say, cheating, that's obviously going to put off students who may have cheated. It's therefore important to make sure that the wording is neutral and doesn't bias the respondents or bias the type of people that are going to respond. Finally, then, it's important when reading a research paper to make sure that you, the reader, have access to the full question set that's been provided to the participants themselves, so you can make your own judgment about whether or not the questions are any good. Now, there's a huge amount that goes into determining whether or not a survey question is any good. And again, this is something for a separate video. There are a couple of common things to look for. The first of these is social desirability bias. This is very basically a tendency for any experimental participant to say the sorts of things that they think the experimenter wants to hear, or that are otherwise socially desirable. This is obviously particularly problematic where the study is asking people about things that they perhaps shouldn't do or might not want to admit to. It's also further complicated where there's an obvious conflict of interest or relationship between the people who are filling in the survey and the people who are administering it. If a particular educator is asking the participants whether or not they thought that their own particular curriculum was any good, it's going to introduce additional problems. The second common thing to look out for is acquiescence bias. This is particularly a problem in research studies that use a lot of Likert type questions. Likert questions or Likert scales tend to start with things like rate your agreement with the statement that, and then some particular statement. We do all have a tendency, particularly when asked lots of questions like this, to simply agree with whatever we're being asked, regardless of what it is. The phrasing of the questions is therefore essential to make sure that there isn't just continuous agreement with all of the statements. There are some other things to look out for. Ethical approval is an important part of any type of research, and in particular research into education. Has ethical approval been obtained, and is it reported? Is there any other conflict of interest, and in particular, who is paying for the study? What is the relationship between the people doing the study and the people who are participating in it? It's not necessarily a problem if there is a conflict of interest, as long as it's explicit and it's taken into account in the analysis and the discussion. It's always important to make sure that there's a pilot study undertaken as part of a questionnaire-based research study. There are often minor mistakes that aren't immediately obvious to the people undertaking or conducting the study, and it's therefore essential that it's tested out with a small group of representative participants. An alternative is to use an existing survey instrument that's already been validated and published elsewhere. Were the data checked? Who entered the data into the spreadsheet or the stats program and then did the analysis? Was there any quality control of that? And then how was non-response treated? If there are a lot of people who haven't completed the survey, or if the response rate is very low, how is that factored into the analysis? That does thus bring us on to the analysis of the data. Now again, we're not going to possibly cover all the different ways in which quantitative data from surveys might be analysed, or qualitative data from surveys might be analysed. But there are some common things to look out for, some common mistakes that people make. The first is to make multiple comparisons. This is particularly a problem when there are large data sets. People end up making lots of different comparisons between two or more groups. If there's no control for the fact that you've made multiple comparisons, then it can mean it's increased likelihood of reporting something as statistically significant when it's not. Correcting for multiple comparisons is the key thing that you want to look out for. The second is a very common mistake in lots of different types of science, and that's mixing up correlation with causation. Just because two things are correlated with each other doesn't necessarily mean that one has caused the other. Finally, a very, very common method of reporting education research data is to collapse data from Likert scales. We talked briefly about them earlier on. You may ask to rate your agreement with a particular phrase. Let's say you're asked to rate your agreement with a statement that my assessment and feedback were returned on time. Now, those sorts of scales are often 5 or 7 points, from strongly agree to strongly disagree, but they're commonly reported as simply the percentage of participants who agree or not. That could mean that 95% of them agree, 50% of those could be in the strongly agree, and 45% in the moderately agree, or 95% of them could be all in the strongly agree category. Those are very different. Take another example. If you've got 50% of participants who report that they agree with a particular statement, what do the other 50% of participants say? Are they in the middle? Are they neutral about the statement? Or do 50% strongly disagree? Those are very different sets of considerations, and it's important then to report all of the data so that you, the reader, can make your own judgment. And all of these things, as I said before, interact. If a study is asking participants to tell the researcher whether or not they've engaged in a problematic behaviour that is quite rare, that is socially undesirable, and the survey has a low response rate from an unrepresentative sample, then that is much more problematic because of the combination of those factors. It's worth considering all of the things individually, but you do have to take a step back and consider the paper as a whole. Okay, here are the references that we've used to inform some of the metrics in this video. If you have any questions about the content of the video, here is my email address. And if you look in the description of the video, there'll be a downloadable checklist that contains some of the things that we've talked about and some additional ones to look for when reading a study that's based upon survey research in education. You can download the checklist and use it whenever you want. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye-bye.